The amber light of the late afternoon sun cascaded through the grand windows of the presidential suite at the Hawthorne Grand Hotel, painting the room in a golden hue. Chicago's bustling skyline served as the backdrop to the quiet opulence of the space. Seated in the suite's plush armchair was Robert Carter, a man whose name was synonymous with power and innovation in the automotive world. For decades, Robert's vision had driven his company to unparalleled success. His empire spanned continents, transforming how millions traveled. Yet, at this very moment, none of it mattered. The ache in his chest, dull at first, had grown sharper, more insistent, spreading down his left arm and climbing up to his jaw. He had felt this kind of discomfort before, a twinge here, a brief ache there, but never like this. The pain had a ferocity that terrified him, though he would never admit it aloud. At 52, Robert Carter prided himself on his resilience. He wasn't just successful, he was indomitable. His visit to Chicago was supposed to be another triumphant chapter in his career. He had come to finalize a merger that would cement his position as one of the most influential figures in the industry. The Hawthorne Grand had been his choice of refuge for years, a place where critical decisions were made in the comfort of anonymity. Its understated elegance mirrored the controlled image he projected to the world. Yet beneath that veneer of control, Robert was unraveling. The luxury of his surroundings offered no comfort as his breathing grew shallow and erratic. His pride fought against the creeping realization of what was happening. "I can't," he started to mutter, but the words dissolved into silence as he clutched his chest. He staggered toward the suite's phone, each step an ordeal. He reached for it, but before his fingers could grasp the receiver, his knees buckled. The room spun, the golden light dimming as darkness enveloped him. For Robert Carter, time seemed to freeze in that moment. A man who had walked through life with unwavering confidence now faced the stark fragility of existence. His mind, in those fleeting seconds of awareness, clung to a singular thought. This can't be the end. Not yet. Just outside the door of Suite 1702, Lena Washington pushed her cleaning cart down the corridor with practiced ease. At 38, Lena exuded an air of quiet efficiency. Her every movement was deliberate, honed by years of experience and discipline. Life hadn't always been this way. Back in her home country of Jamaica, Lena had been a nurse. Her hands, now accustomed to scrubbing surfaces and arranging linens, had once administered life-saving care to patients in overcrowded hospitals. She had chosen this path to provide a better future for her teenage daughter, leaving behind a profession she loved to navigate the challenges of starting over in a foreign land. 2 years into her life in America, Lena still felt like an outsider. The barriers, bureaucratic red tape, unfamiliar systems, and subtle prejudices kept her from reclaiming her role as a caregiver. But she had adapted. Each task she performed at the hotel was a quiet assertion of her dignity. As she neared the door of the presidential suite, a muffled sound caught her attention. Lena paused, her instincts sharpening. Her years in the hospital had attuned her to the subtle signs of distress. She knocked softly. "Sir?" she called out, her voice calm but firm. No response. Frowning, she knocked again, harder this time. "Hello? Sir, are you all right?" Still, silence. Lena hesitated for only a moment before retrieving the master key from her cart. Stepping inside, her eyes immediately landed on Robert's collapsed form. He lay motionless on the floor, his face pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. Her training surged to the forefront of her mind. "Heart attack," she muttered under her breath, the diagnosis clear as day. Without wasting a second, she crossed the room to the bedside phone and dialed 911. "This is an emergency," she said, her Jamaican accent coloring her calm, precise words. "A man in his early 50s has collapsed in Suite 1702 at the Hawthorne Grand Hotel. He's unresponsive, likely a cardiac event. "Please send an ambulance immediately." The operator assured her that help was on the way, but Lena didn't stop there. She returned to Robert's side, checking his pulse and breathing. Both were faint, irregular. "Stay with me," she murmured, rolling up her sleeves. With swift, practiced movements, she unbuttoned his shirt to improve circulation and placed her hands on his chest. Compress, release, compress, release. Her hands moved in a steady rhythm, the weight of each motion a bridge between life and death. She tilted his head back gently, opened his airway, and delivered 2 measured breaths. The cycle repeated, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, over and over, her determination unwavering. The scent of her perfume, a delicate blend of vanilla and jasmine, lingered in the air, a subtle counterpoint to the tension in the room. As the minutes dragged on, the sound of approaching sirens offered the first glimmer of hope. The paramedics burst through the door, their equipment in hand. One knelt beside Robert, assessing his condition, while the other turned to Lena with a nod of respect. "You did everything right," he said, his tone both professional and grateful. Lena stepped back, her chest heaving with exertion as she watched them connect Robert to a defibrillator. His body jolted under the electrical pulses, a stark reminder of how close he had come to the edge. As the elevator doors closed behind the paramedics, Lena stood in the now quiet suite. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her with a mix of exhaustion and reflection. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her uniform, regaining her composure. She returned to her cart and resumed her duties, though her mind was far from the task at hand. The man she had just saved, a stranger whose life she had touched in an unspoken way, was alive. That knowledge was enough. That evening, Lena returned to her modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. The small 2-bedroom space she shared with her daughter was filled with warmth despite its simplicity. As she prepared dinner, her thoughts remained tethered to the events of the day. The image of Robert Carter lying motionless on the floor replayed in her mind. She couldn't help but wonder about him. Who was he? What kind of life did he lead? And most of all, would he survive the night? "Mama, you're quiet today," her daughter Amara observed. Setting the table with careful hands, Lena forced a smile. "Just tired, love. Work was long." Amara studied her mother for a moment, then nodded. "You always work too hard." Lena chuckled softly, her daughter's words easing the tension in her chest. "It's worth it, as long as it's for you." But as the evening wore on, Lena found no solace. Her thoughts returned to Robert again and again. Finally, unable to shake the feeling that she needed to do more, she made a decision. The next day, after finishing her shift at the hotel, Lena made her way to St. Joseph's Medical Center. The hospital loomed large and impersonal, its fluorescent lights casting a cold glow over the reception area. Lena approached the front desk hesitantly, her voice soft but clear. "Good evening. I'm here to check on a patient. Robert Carter. He was admitted yesterday." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a tired smile, glanced up. Her eyes briefly flicked over Lena's modest attire, a hint of curiosity in her expression. "Are you family?" "No," Lena admitted, her hands gripping the strap of her bag. "But I was there when he collapsed. I just want to know if he's all right." The receptionist hesitated, then relented. "He's stable. Still in the ICU, but his condition is improving." Relief flooded Lena's chest, but it was quickly replaced by another emotion, sadness. "Has anyone been to see him?" The receptionist shook her head. "No family or visitors so far." Lena thanked her and stepped away from the desk. She lingered in the waiting area, her thoughts swirling. How could someone so influential, so seemingly untouchable, be completely alone in such a vulnerable moment? Though she knew she wouldn't be allowed to visit him yet, Lena resolved to return the next day. Over the following days, Lena became a quiet fixture at the hospital. After her shifts at the Hawthorne Grand, she would take the bus across town and spend her evenings in the waiting room. Each night she checked on Robert's progress, her inquiries brief but sincere. The nurses began to recognize her, and one evening a kind woman with a warm smile offered her a small kindness. "You've been here every day," the nurse said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "He's still asleep, but if you'd like, you can see him for a moment." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse led her down a quiet corridor. Each step felt heavier than the last as Lena approached Robert's room. When the nurse opened the door, Lena hesitated. Inside, Robert lay in a hospital bed, his powerful presence diminished by the tubes and machines that surrounded him. His face, usually so composed, was pale and vulnerable. Lena stepped closer, her movements cautious and deliberate. She stood by his bedside for a long moment, simply observing. Seeing him like this, stripped of the strength and arrogance she'd glimpsed in passing, stirred something deep within her. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice trembling. "That's all that matters." She didn't stay long, not wanting to intrude. Before leaving, she leaned down and whispered softly, "Take this second chance. Life doesn't always give us another." The words were meant for him, but in truth, they were also for herself. 2 weeks later, Robert Carter returned to the Hawthorne Grand. His body had recovered enough for him to leave the hospital, but his mind remained restless. The experience had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Walking through the hotel's pristine hallways, he felt a surge of irritation at how little had changed. The world had carried on as though nothing had happened, while he had come face to face with his own mortality. As he rounded a corner, he nearly collided with a cleaning cart. Lena, busy restocking her supplies, looked up in surprise. "Watch it," Robert snapped, his frustration spilling over. "I'm sorry, sir," Lena replied, her voice calm but steady. She met his gaze, a flicker of recognition passing through her eyes. Robert, however, saw only the uniform and the woman wearing it. "You people should be more careful," he muttered under his breath, the dismissiveness in his tone unmistakable. Lena felt the sting of his words, but refused to let it show. She straightened her posture and responded, "Accidents happen, Mr. Carter. It's how we handle them that matters." Her words gave Robert pause, though he quickly brushed off the moment and walked away. That night, Robert returned to his suite. He poured himself a glass of water and sat by the window, the city lights stretching out before him. Yet his thoughts were elsewhere. The scent of vanilla and jasmine lingered faintly in the air, stirring a memory he couldn't quite place. He inhaled deeply, trying to pinpoint its significance. The following morning, Robert stirred in his bed as sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of his suite. He had spent the night wrestling with fragmented memories, the faint scent of vanilla and jasmine weaving through his dreams like a ghost. Rising slowly, his movements still careful from his recent ordeal, he walked to the window and gazed out at the city below. Something about the smell lingered, elusive yet familiar, nagging at the edges of his consciousness. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Assuming it was room service, he opened it brusquely, only to find Lena standing there, her cleaning supplies in hand. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, Robert froze. There was something in her calm, steady gaze that unsettled him. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Lena said, her tone polite but neutral. "I'm here to clean the room." Robert stepped aside, his usual sharp retort absent. He watched as she moved about the room with quiet efficiency, her hands meticulous, as she straightened the bedding and dusted the furniture. "Have we met before?" he blurted out suddenly, the question surprising even himself. Lena paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "No, sir," she replied carefully, her back still to him. Robert narrowed his eyes. There was something in her voice, a trace of familiarity he couldn't ignore. "You seem familiar." Lena turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps you've seen me in the hallways. I've worked here for a while." Robert nodded slowly but remained unconvinced. The scent of vanilla and jasmine drifted toward him as she moved, triggering the same elusive memory. "Thank you," he said abruptly, catching Lena off guard. She tilted her head slightly. "For what, sir?" Robert hesitated, then shook his head. "Never mind." Lena gave him a small nod before finishing her work and leaving the room. As the door clicked shut behind her, Robert found himself staring at the spot where she had stood, the lingering scent once again pulling at his thoughts. Days passed, and Robert began to notice Lena more frequently around the hotel. Each time their paths crossed, he felt a growing sense of unease, as though she held a secret he couldn't quite grasp. One evening, unable to shake the feeling, he called down to the front desk. "The cleaning staff member who tends to my suite. What's her name?" "Her name is Lena Washington, sir," the receptionist replied. The name didn't stir any recognition, but the nagging sense of familiarity persisted. Meanwhile, Lena continued her work as usual, though she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in Robert's demeanor. He seemed less sharp, less aloof, his interactions tinged with an unspoken curiosity. One evening, as Lena finished her shift, she decided to stop by the hospital. Though she hadn't visited since Robert's discharge, a part of her wanted to confirm what she already knew, that he had indeed recovered fully. The hospital's fluorescent lights felt harsher than she remembered as she walked through the familiar hallways. She paused outside the ICU wing, her footsteps slowing as memories of that night resurfaced. "Can I help you?" a nurse asked, her tone kind but professional. Lena shook her head. "No, thank you. I was just passing through." She turned and left, her heart heavy with the knowledge that while Robert had moved on, the experience still lingered within her. That weekend, Lena arrived at the Hawthorne Grand for her shift, only to find Robert waiting in the lobby. He stood by the marble fountain, his posture straight, but his expression unreadable. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Lena said as she passed him, her voice steady. "Wait," he called after her, his tone softer than she expected. Lena stopped, turning to face him. "I need to ask you something," Robert said, his eyes searching hers. "That night, the night I collapsed. Were you there?" Lena's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she considered denying it, keeping her role in his recovery a secret, but something in his gaze, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before, made her pause. "Yes," she admitted quietly, "I was there." Robert's shoulders relaxed, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. "I thought so," he said. "The scent, vanilla and jasmine, it stayed with me." Lena's lips curved into a faint smile. "It's just a perfume, Mr. Carter." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's more than that. It's you." Lena didn't know how to respond. The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. Finally she said, "I didn't save you for thanks, if that's what you're worried about." Robert nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but thank you anyway." For the first time, Lena saw a flicker of humility in his eyes. It was a quiet acknowledgment of the humanity they shared, despite the chasm that separated their worlds. In the weeks that followed, their interactions became less formal. Robert began greeting Lena whenever he saw her, his tone warmer, his demeanor less guarded. He found himself drawn to her quiet strength, the way she carried herself with dignity despite the challenges she faced. Lena, in turn, saw glimpses of the man behind the power, the vulnerability he worked so hard to conceal. Though they rarely spoke of that night, its impact lingered, shaping the unspoken bond between them. One evening, as Lena pushed her cart down the hall, she found a small envelope tucked under her door. Inside was a handwritten note. "Lena, you reminded me that life is more than success or power. It's about the connections we make, even in the most unexpected moments. Thank you for showing me that. Robert. Lena folded the note carefully, her heart full. Though their lives would continue on separate paths, she knew their shared moment would remain a part of both of them, a quiet testament to the strength found in compassion and connection. In the quiet opulence of the Hawthorne Grand Hotel, the presidential suite echoed with the tension of unspoken truths. Martha Rosario stood by the doorway, her hands calm despite the storm that brewed in the room. Her uniform, modest yet pristine, bore the subtle fragrance of vanilla and jasmine, a scent that seemed to linger like a soft breeze in the vastness of Robert Kensington's suite. Martha's words hung in the air, resonating with an undeniable weight. "Perhaps I do not seem important to you, Mr. Kensington," she said in a steady voice, her gaze unwavering. "But in moments of fragility, we are all the same." For a moment the room was still. Robert, whose posture radiated superiority, felt an unfamiliar shift within him. Her words pierced through the layers of his ego, striking something raw and unprotected. He masked his discomfort with a cold stare, but deep down he was rattled. Martha held her ground, her composure intact, as silence filled the space between them. She had spoken her truth without malice, yet it had landed with a force that neither of them could ignore. Robert clenched his jaw, his irritation barely restrained. "Are you going to finish your work?" he said sharply. "Or should I call someone else, someone more suitable?" The words dripped with disdain, a familiar tone of condescension that Martha had faced countless times before. But she refused to let his venom shake her. "Mr. Kensington," she replied calmly, her tone even, "you shouldn't let anger take hold after suffering a myocardial infarction. It's not good for your heart." The words stopped him cold. His hand, which had hovered over the phone moments earlier, froze mid-motion. His eyes widened, a mixture of alarm and confusion flashing across his face. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. Martha's mind raced. She hadn't intended to reveal herself, but her instincts had spoken before she could catch them. She needed an explanation, quickly. "I was cleaning nearby," she said, her voice light but steady. "I saw the paramedics rushing to your suite. I assumed it must have been something serious." Robert studied her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't entirely convinced, but he couldn't find a flaw in her logic either. Slowly, he lowered the phone, though the unease in his chest remained. "You have 15 minutes to finish," he said curtly. "Then I'll be speaking to management about your incompetence." Martha inclined her head gracefully and returned to her task, methodically collecting the used sheets and replacing the linens. Her movements were precise, her focus unbroken, as if the tension in the room didn't exist. From his seat on the plush sofa, Robert watched her with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. His mind churned with questions he couldn't voice, his thoughts flitting between her calm demeanor and the nagging sense that there was more to her than met the eye. As Martha worked, the faint scent of her perfume wafted through the air. Robert inhaled it absent-mindedly, and with it came a memory, faint but persistent. It was the same fragrance that had enveloped him in the hospital, the same subtle aroma that had given him an inexplicable sense of peace during his recovery. He frowned, his thoughts growing more tangled. Who was this woman, really? Martha finished her work and moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the knob as if weighing a decision. Then she turned, her deep brown eyes locking onto Robert's. "Flowers can heal," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But to heal your heart, you must first let go of the emotions that weigh it down." Her words hung in the air like a gentle challenge. Robert blinked, startled by the sudden shift in her tone. "Why would you say that?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "And what do you know about my heart needing to be healed?" Martha smiled faintly, her gaze steady. "There are things one can sense, Mr. Kensington," she replied. "Sometimes the silence in a room tells you everything you need to know about the burdens someone carries." Robert stared at her, his mind scrambling for a retort. But the weight of her words was undeniable. He felt exposed, as though she had glimpsed a part of him he'd worked hard to keep hidden. "Flowers," he said at last, the word foreign on his tongue. "Why would you bring me flowers?" Martha's expression softened. "Because sometimes the simplest things are the most profound," she said. "Flowers bring beauty without expecting anything in return. They remind us that even in the hardest winters, something can bloom." Robert's gaze remained fixed on her, his mind awash with conflicting emotions. Her words made no logical sense, yet they stirred something deep within him, a quiet yearning he couldn't name. "Fine," he said finally, his voice low. "Bring the flowers." Martha smiled, a small, knowing smile that carried the weight of centuries of wisdom. Without another word, she turned the knob and slipped out of the room, leaving Robert alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Robert awoke to a suite transformed. Sunflowers, vibrant, golden, and full of life, filled the room. Arrangements adorned the tables and window sills, their bright petals seeming to reach for the sunlight streaming through the curtains. In the center of it all, on the glass coffee table, stood the largest bouquet of all. Nestled within the flowers was a small card, its edges delicately embossed. Robert approached the table slowly, his movements cautious, as if afraid to disturb the serenity of the scene. He picked up the card and read the words written in elegant script. "Flowers ask for nothing, yet they bring light to all who see them. Perhaps they will remind you that beauty, like healing, comes quietly. M.R." He reread the note, the simplicity of the message striking a chord deep within him. He sat on the edge of the sofa, the bouquet before him, and felt a rare stillness settle over him. For the first time in years, Robert Kensington let himself breathe. Robert remained seated on the edge of the sofa, the weight of the note in his hand feeling heavier than it should. The vibrant sunflowers filled the suite with a quiet joy, but inside him a storm brewed. He stared at the card, rereading its simple yet profound message. He tried to dismiss it as meaningless sentimentality, but the words clung to him. Beauty, like healing, comes quietly. It was unsettling. Robert Kensington was a man accustomed to grandeur and dominance, to transactions and deals. Yet here, a humble gesture, a bouquet of sunflowers and a note signed with just initials, had rendered him speechless. His gaze fell back to the largest bouquet, and the scent of the flowers mixed with the faint, lingering aroma of vanilla and jasmine. It wasn't the first time he had noticed it. That scent had haunted him since the hospital. He couldn't shake the feeling that the young woman who had stood so confidently in his suite the previous day, Martha Rosario, was connected to the most vulnerable moment of his life. The next morning, Robert descended to the hotel lobby, dressed impeccably as always. His steps were measured, deliberate, but his thoughts raced. He wasn't entirely sure why he was seeking out Martha, but he knew he needed answers. He spotted her near the terrace, diligently polishing the brass railing along the glass balcony. She worked with quiet precision, her expression focused, her movements fluid. "Martha," he called, his voice firm. She straightened and turned, surprised to see him, but quick to regain her composure. "Mr. Kensington," she replied, inclining her head politely. "How can I assist you?" For a moment he said nothing, studying her as though searching for a hidden clue. Finally he spoke. "I need to know something." Martha raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. "Of course." "That day," he began, his voice softer now, "the day I collapsed. Were you there?" Martha's breath hitched, though her face remained calm. Her mind raced as she debated how much to reveal. She had kept her role in saving him a secret, believing it was enough that he had survived. "Yes," she admitted finally, her tone measured. "I was there." Robert frowned, his suspicion confirmed. "Why didn't you say anything?" "It wasn't my place," Martha replied simply. Her response threw him. "Not your place?" You saved my life." She shrugged slightly, her calm demeanor unshaken. "What matters is that you're here now, Mr. Kensington. That's enough for me." Her humility disarmed him. He wasn't used to people who acted without expectation of reward or recognition. It made him uneasy, even as it stirred something unfamiliar within him. Later that day, Robert's curiosity got the better of him. He requested access to the hotel's security footage from the day of his heart attack, using his influence to bypass the usual protocols. The grainy black and white footage from the hallway outside his suite played on the screen in the security office. He watched as Martha appeared, her cleaning cart in tow, her expression focused. She knocked on the door, then hesitated before using the master key to enter. The next moments unfolded with startling clarity. Robert watched as Martha sprang into action, kneeling beside his unconscious body. Her movements were precise, her face calm but determined as she began administering CPR. The recording showed her working tirelessly, chest compressions, breaths, repeating the cycle with unwavering focus. Then she reached for the phone to call emergency services, her voice calm as she relayed critical details. Robert's chest tightened as he watched the scene. She had fought for his life with the same quiet dignity she carried in her daily work, never seeking acknowledgement for her actions. "Impressive," the hotel manager murmured, breaking the silence. She never mentioned a word of this to anyone. Robert nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen. "She didn't do it for recognition," he said, almost to himself. That evening, Robert approached Martha as she was finishing her shift. She stood in the lobby collecting her supplies, her expression serene. "Martha," he said, his voice softer than usual. She turned, her brow furrowing slightly in surprise. "Yes, Mr. Kensington?" "I know," he said simply. Her eyes searched his, and she realized he had seen the footage. "Then you know why I stayed silent," she replied. Robert hesitated, then nodded. "I do. But I need you to understand something." Martha folded her arms gently across her chest, waiting. "I've spent my life building walls," he admitted. "I thought power and wealth were the only things that mattered. But you—" He paused, his voice faltering. "You saved me. And it wasn't just my life you saved. It was something more." Martha tilted her head, her expression softening. "What are you trying to say, Mr. Kensington?" Robert took a deep breath. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I do know this. You've changed something in me, and for that I owe you more than I can ever repay." Martha smiled faintly, her gaze steady. "Sometimes," she said, "what we owe isn't measured in money or gratitude. It's measured in how we choose to move forward." Her words stayed with him long after she had walked away, her perfume lingering in the air. The following day, Robert left the Hawthorne Grand. He carried with him more than just his belongings. He carried a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. On his desk at home, he placed a single sunflower in a glass vase, a quiet reminder of the woman who had saved him in every way that mattered. One crisp morning, as the autumn leaves began to scatter across the city streets, Robert decided to act. He returned to the Hawthorne Grand, his steps purposeful, yet tinged with an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. In the hotel lobby, he spotted Martha organizing her supplies, her movements as precise and efficient as ever. Taking a deep breath, he approached her. "Martha," he began, his voice soft yet firm. She looked up, surprised but composed. "Mr. Kensington," she greeted him, her tone polite as always. "I need to speak with you," he said, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the lobby. Martha hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly, but she nodded. "Of course." They walked to a seating area, bathed in soft light from the tall windows. The city bustled beyond the glass, but inside the air felt still, charged with unspoken words. Robert sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. For a moment he seemed at a loss for how to begin. Then he spoke. "You've changed my life," he said, his voice carrying the weight of sincerity. Martha blinked, caught off guard by the statement. "I only did what anyone would have done, Mr. Kensington," she replied, her tone modest. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's not true. Most people wouldn't have done what you did, not with the grace, the courage, and the humility you showed." Martha's expression softened, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "I've spent my entire life thinking that power and wealth were the only things that mattered," Robert confessed. "That success was measured by how much you could control, how much you could accumulate. But you've shown me something different." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "You saved me, not just my life, but something deeper. You made me see what I've been missing all along." Martha's lips curved into a gentle smile. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it takes a brush with mortality to see life for what it really is." Robert nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I want to change," he said. "I want to live differently, to live better. And I want you to be part of that." Martha's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. "I'm not sure I understand." Robert leaned forward, his gaze earnest. "I need someone like you in my life, someone who reminds me of what truly matters. I don't just mean as an employee or a caretaker. I mean as a partner, a friend, someone who keeps me grounded." Martha's breath caught in her throat. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but his words carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Kensington," she began carefully, "I am honored that you feel this way, but—" "Please," he interrupted gently, "call me Robert." She hesitated, her gaze searching his. "Robert," she said finally, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. "What you're asking, it's more than I can promise." "I'm not asking for a promise," he replied. "I'm asking for a chance to show you that I can be better, that I want to be better." Martha's eyes softened, her expression contemplative. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally she sighed, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You've got a lot to learn, Robert," she said, "but maybe I can help you figure it out." The weeks that followed marked a transformation in Robert Kensington's life. He began to dismantle the walls he had built around himself, letting vulnerability and authenticity guide his actions. With Martha's quiet wisdom as his anchor, he found himself reconnecting with parts of himself he had long buried. Martha, too, found her life changing in unexpected ways. Though she was hesitant at first, she grew to appreciate Robert's genuine efforts to change. Their conversations deepened, moving beyond surface-level pleasantries to discussions about life, love, and the human condition. One evening, as they walked through a park adorned with the golden hues of autumn, Robert stopped and turned to Martha. "I've spent my life chasing things that don't matter," he said, his voice steady. "But now I want to chase something that does." Martha tilted her head, her gaze questioning. "You," he said simply. "I want to chase you." A warm laugh escaped her lips, the sound light and full of life. "Robert," she said, her eyes sparkling, "I'm not sure you're ready for that journey." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Then help me get ready." Months later, in a small, intimate ceremony, Robert and Martha stood beneath a canopy of sunflowers, their lives forever entwined. The fragrance of vanilla and jasmine mingled with the crisp autumn air as they exchanged vows, promising not perfection, but partnership. Their love was not the grand, sweeping kind found in fairy tales. It was quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in the understanding that they had saved each other in ways neither could have foreseen. As they walked hand in hand into their new life, the world around them seemed to bloom, just as it always does when two souls find their way home to each other.